Okay, we are on, Roman numeral 13, I think, which is the Bible is from God, or evidences that the Bible is from God. And we looked at predictive prophecy and scientific accuracy and foreknowledge, and then the third was factual accuracy, and really closely connected in part of this factual accuracy point is our fourth point here, which is archaeological confirmation. And so we began looking at some interesting tidbits from archaeological finds and so forth as they relate to different biblical accounts. And so we started with the Old Testament, and we were looking at the events surrounding Hezekiah, good King Hezekiah, who came to the throne after his father, who was, by the way, an evil king. So it's interesting. We can blame our problems on a lot of things, and we tend to do that in our society. Everybody's a victim. But it's interesting when you read the Old Testament, especially about the Judean kings. Now, in the nation of Israel, I don't guess there was a good king. But when it came to the southern tribe of Judah, there were some good kings, and it's interesting that I don't know if there was ever two good kings in a row. So what that means, of course, is that there would have been a bad king, and his son was a good king. And when I say good and bad, I mean as far as their relationship to God and His law. And so you would have a bad king, then a good king, then a bad king, and a good king. And these are father sons. So obviously, sometimes we like to say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but the apple falls wherever the apple wants to fall when it comes to people. And whether your parents are good or bad, whether they obey God or not, you can do it, even if they don't. Does it help to come from a godly family? Absolutely. It's an advantage. But we see from these accounts that a lot of people don't take advantage of what they've been provided. And we see that even in the church today. But Hezekiah comes to the throne, and of course we read, let's go back to 2 Chronicles 32. And again, this is another interesting point we don't have time to discuss, but we already have really in our discussion of evil, pain, and suffering. But it's always an interesting opening to me in chapter 32 where you go to the end of chapter 31, and Hezekiah did what was good and right and true before the Lord his God, and every work that he began in the service of the house of God and in the law and the commandment to seek his God, he did it with all his heart, and he prospered. But it's interesting the way chapter 32 begins, after these deeds of faithfulness. So here he is, he's faithful, he's doing what he's supposed to do. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered Judah. And so here he is, he's doing what he's supposed to do, and yet guess what comes his way? Trials, difficulties. And so again, good or bad, we're not exempt from those things. And we talked about that in some detail. But Sennacherib enters the land thinking to win them over against. And notice he encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them over to himself. We noticed that Sennacherib was the king of Assyria. The capital of Assyria was what? Nineveh, that's right. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. And Sargon, after his death, there were a lot of conquered peoples that had more or less revolted against the Assyrians, and so Sennacherib decides he's got to show them who's boss, and so he invades the land. And so we spent quite a bit of time last week, and we'll just summarize, but we looked at 2 Kings 20:20. Now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, all his might, how he made a pool and a tunnel and brought water into the city, and obviously during a siege, one of the most important things you're going to need is a source of water. And Hezekiah cut an 1,800-foot tunnel under the city of Jerusalem to bring water into the city. We noticed it not only there, but also, if you'll notice 2 Chronicles 32:30, this same Hezekiah also stopped the water outlet of Upper Gihon and brought the water by tunnel to the west side of the city of David. And so archaeologists have found this tunnel, known as Hezekiah's Tunnel. And you can actually see pictures of it. You can go see it if you go to Jerusalem. And I've talked to people that have seen it. And it's interesting, we mentioned in 1880 about these two boys swimming near there and found the inscription about 20 feet from the exit of the tunnel, in which they described the work. The workmen described how they started from opposite ends. Imagine the engineering feat. We sometimes think of people in those days as being backward and ignorant, and certainly not modern like we are, but still, I mean, to start on opposite ends and then meet in the middle, that's not an easy feat. And so, especially since they were about probably 60 to 70 feet underground, cutting through rock. And so this inscription is considered to be one of the most important and certainly famous that's ever been found in that area. And so we talked about that quite a bit. Now the next thing we want to mention, and this again is connected to this siege of Sennacherib. We're talking about archaeological confirmation. And again, we're talking about still on the subject of Sennacherib and his invasion of Judah. And we have a lot of information regarding his campaign from what's known as the Taylor Prism. And it is a 6-sided clay artifact that's about 15 inches tall. It was found in Nineveh in the year of 1830 by a British Colonel, R. Taylor. So, now you know why it's called the Taylor Prism. Usually that's the way these archaeological artifacts get named. If you find one, you get to name it. It wasn't Robert Taylor either, was it? No, it wasn't Robert Taylor, not in 1830. This prism contains 6 columns with over 500 lines of writing. It was purchased in the 20s and donated to the Oriental Institute in Chicago. And so let's read part of the text from the Taylor Prism. This is about Sennacherib's account of his military tour of Judah. As to Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities. What does the Bible say? He entered the land of Judah and came against what? All the fortified cities and thought to win them for himself. You recall during those days, and even when Israel conquered the land when they came out of Egypt, but certainly all the time that they lived there, you had cities that actually had walls and gates and were fortified, and then you had the towns in the countryside that were not. And so if an invader entered the land, the people that lived in the towns, the smaller towns and the countryside would do what? Right, they would have to flee to the nearest fortified city for protection. He says, I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts and to the countless small villages in their vicinity, and conquered them by means of well-stamped earth ramps and battering rams brought near to the walls, combined with the attack by foot soldiers using mines, breaches, as well as sapper work. I drove out of them 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, big and small cattle beyond counting, and considered them booty. Himself I made a prisoner, talking about Hezekiah. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal palace, like a bird in a cage. I surrounded him with earthwork in order to molest those who were leaving his city's gate. Now that's Sennacherib's account of his invasion of Judah. So there's 2 things we want to discuss with regard to Sennacherib's own statement. First, it parallels 32:1, that he encamped against the fortified cities. That part does. He conquered a bunch of fortified cities. He says he came against 46 of them. Now, the most noteworthy city that Sennacherib conquered And they've done a ton of archaeological work at this site, and that's the city of Lachish. And he actually besieged Lachish and captured it. But the other thing that you'll notice in Sennacherib's own words is that he never captured Jerusalem. Now, he shut up, what's his name, Hezekiah, like a bird in a cage, but he never captured the city. So let's look at the biblical account. Go to 2 Kings 18. And let's see, look in verse 18. Excuse me, 14. 18:14. Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong, turn away from me, whatever you impose on me, I will pay. So, in this account, Sennacherib is besieging Lachish. And while he's doing that, before he can besiege Jerusalem, Hezekiah says, look, I apologize. Tell me what it'll cost me. And he actually sends him money. But unfortunately, you can't trust Sennacherib because he takes the money and he still doesn't leave. And if you'll notice, Sennacherib demanded 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold, which Hezekiah paid. But if you go down to verse 17, even though he got the money, he still sends his officials to Jerusalem to demand their surrender. And if you'll recall, they're outside the city wall saying all kinds of nasty things and what they're going to do to the inhabitants of the city if they don't surrender. And you recall the account, how that the officials, Hezekiah's officials, even asked the Assyrian emissaries to not speak in the Jews' language. And they said, well, we're going to speak in whatever language we want to because these fellows that are up there on the wall with you, they need to understand what's going to happen to them if they don't give up. And so their officials return, and notice 19 verse 8. By the time they get back to Sennacherib, they find him warring against what? Libnah, for he heard that he had departed from Lachish. Well, we don't get much information about the Battle of Lachish from the Bible, only that he laid siege to it, and then from there went on to Libnah. But here's what they have found about the Battle of Lachish, the archaeologists have found. Sennacherib thought that his victory at Lachish was such a big deal that he dedicated an entire wall, about 70 feet of his palace in Nineveh, to telling the story of this battle. Carved reliefs depicting the event. In the mid-1840s, a renowned English archaeologist, Henry Layard, began excavating the ruins of Nineveh. Published his finds in 1849 in several places, and you can look all of that up. There's several books. And since then, they have located and identified a bunch of more stuff in at least 3 different locations. The remains of ancient Nineveh are located in 2 mounds on opposite banks of the I don't know how you say this, the river there, Halsar River. One of the mounds contains the remains of the palaces of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. Esarhaddon took over after Sennacherib, and he's in the biblical text as well. The other mound on the other side of the river has the palace of Sennacherib. They were built on raised platforms of about 75 feet. And so on this wall depicting Sennacherib's defeat of the city of Lachish, one of the archaeologists gives this description. The main scene shows the attack on the gate wall of Lachish. The protruding city gate is presented in minute detail with its crenellations and its special reinforcement by a superstructure of warrior shields. The battering rams were moved over specially constructed ramps covered with wooden logs. They were prefabricated, 4-wheeled, turreted machines, and the scene vividly shows frenzied fighting of both attacker and defender in the final stage of the battle. He says it shows flaming firebrands that the defenders launched at the attackers. Long-handled ladle-like instruments used to douse the front of the battering rams when they were set on fire. Slingmen, archers, and assault troops with spears. And one of the most, and I've seen a picture of this, one of the most striking features of the relief on this wall is the depiction of the tortures inflicted on the inhabitants of Lachish. Several prisoners are pictured impaled on poles while women and children from the city are led past the victims. And the epigraph that accompanies the relief says, Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria, sat upon a throne and passed in review the booty taken from Lachish. So it's interesting. The Bible just says, he besieged Lachish and then he moved on. Sennacherib thought it was a big deal, his defeat of this well-fortified city. And so it's interesting. They've now done all these digs at Lachish, and they have found, in the words of some of these archaeologists, enormous sloping siege ramps thrown up against the city walls south of the gate, a double line of defense walls, upslope and downslope, iron-shod Assyrian battering rams that breached the city wall. They have discovered all the destruction within the city, basically confirmed everything by archaeology that they found on the wall in Sennacherib's palace. Found iron arrowheads and all kinds of counter ramps inside the city. The destroyed gate covered by up to 6 feet of destruction debris. Huge boulders from the city wall burned almost to lime. And so all of that confirms the biblical text. But here's the best part of the whole deal. If you go back to Sennacherib's statement, he says he shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. And yet he says he never conquered Jerusalem. Now, think about it. Sennacherib puts his success at Lachish on a 70-foot wall. Now, what would you think he would have done in his palace if he'd have taken the capital city? I mean, maybe a 140-foot wall, right? But he didn't take the capital city. And yet, from archaeology, they don't know why. Herschel Shanks, author of Jerusalem, an archaeological biography, wrote, although we don't know for sure what broke the siege, we do know that the Israelites managed to hold out. Well, we know what broke the siege. Go over to Isaiah chapter 37. Why didn't Sennacherib take the city? And most of you already know. Now go back. Let's start a little. Let's go back up to verse. Isaiah is sent to Hezekiah there in verse 21. And he says, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because you have prayed to me against Sennacherib, king of Assyria, this is the word which the Lord has spoken concerning him. And he goes on and talks about Sennacherib's arrogance, about how, look at all this wonderful things that I've done. Look at verse 26. Did you not hear long ago how I made it? From ancient times that I formed it? And so forth. Look at verse 28. This is God talking about Sennacherib. But I know your dwelling place, your going out and your coming in, and your rage against me. Because your rage against me and your tumult have come up to my ears, therefore I will put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back by the way which you came. Now what is significant about that? I will put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips and turn you around and take you back by the way which you came. What is significant about that? God telling Sennacherib that.
He's in control.
But why would that mean something to Sennacherib if he were to hear these words? That's how the Assyrians took their prisoners back to Assyria. Is they put them in long lines of chains and put literally hooks in their noses and their lips and pulled them like that all the way back. They were all strung together like fish. That's how they treated people. This shall be a sign to you. Talking to Hezekiah. You shall eat this year such as grows of itself, and the second year what springs from the same. Also in the third year sow and reap, plant vineyards, eat the fruit of them. And the remnant who have escaped to the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go a remnant, and those who escape from Mount Zion. The zeal of the Lord of the host will do this. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor build a siege mount against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and he shall not come into this city, says the Lord, for I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. Then, verse 36, the angel of the Lord, literally the messenger of Jehovah, the pre-incarnate Christ, the second member of the Godhead, went out that night and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when people arose early in the morning, there were the corpses, all dead. So Sennacherib and his bunch get up the next morning, his officers, and guess what they've got on their hands? 185,000 dead soldiers. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went away and returned home and remained at Nineveh. Now it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch his god, that his sons Adramelech and Sharezer struck him down with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. Then Esarhaddon his son reigned in his place. Now, you have to be careful when you read. This is not a novel. It's not a TV show. So when he says, now it came to pass, first of all, just to travel back to Nineveh would have taken a month probably. Okay? So when it says now it came to pass, it doesn't mean like next week, by the way, Sennacherib was worshiping in the temple and his two sons killed him. Actually, I think history tells us this occurred about 17 years later. Okay? So when the Bible says now it came to pass, don't put your own time frame in there. But here's the interesting part. Of course, Sennacherib couldn't boast about a victory over Jerusalem because he didn't get one. And here's what the Assyrian records note about how Sennacherib died. This is an inscription from Esarhaddon's Chronicles. That's the son that took his place. He says, in the month Nisanu, on a favorable day, complying with their exalted command, I made my joyful entrance into the royal palace, an awesome place wherein abides the fate of kings. A firm determination fell upon my brothers. They forsook the gods and turned to their deeds of violence, plotting evil. To gain the kingship, they slew Sennacherib their father. Now that's from Esarhaddon, the son who took over. He says, my brothers killed our father. They were violent and they were evil. And so again, that is an actual inscription from Esarhaddon's Chronicles, of course confirming the biblical record. It's all it's pretty interesting events there between Sennacherib and Hezekiah. The problem with Sennacherib that he had was he didn't realize that it was a situation between him and Hezekiah. His fight was with who? God. And so that didn't turn out so well for him. Any questions or comments about all of that archaeological stuff with Hezekiah and Sennacherib? This next section we're going to skip. I didn't really mean to put that back in there, the significance of bullae. Well, it's kind of an interesting study, but it's not as far along as some of these others, and some of the finds are disputed, and they haven't confirmed a lot of it. How did people write back then? What did they use? Do what? No, not by then. They did, on walls and things of that nature, but they were also using some other things. Scrolls, by that time, by the 500 or 600 BC, they were using scrolls of papyrus and leather, which we call vellum. And what would happen when they finished with a roll, they would roll it into a cylinder shape, tie it with a string, and then in order to secure it more, or to make it more secure, and also to note who the author or the sender was, they would take a bead of soft clay or soft wax or soft metal, place it over the string, and then with a stamping device, you remember the Romans had rings for this, but with a stamping device, they would press it into that soft clay or whatever it was, and that would leave an inscription. So those clay seals are known as bullae, the plural form of the word bulla. And here's the deal. They have found hundreds of these things in the Palestine area over the years. And the reason that's interesting is they found all kinds of names. Like the name Baruch. Who was Baruch? Anybody remember? Who was Baruch? No. Baruch was somebody's scribe. Whose scribe was Baruch? Jeremiah's, right, Jeremiah's. And so they have found a lot of names, which, by the way, finding these names on these little clay, I don't know what you'd call them, coins almost, but seals, confirms, of course, the use of the names during those times. But they have found names like a bulla that says Barachiu, son of Neriah, blessed of Yahweh. Well, that in our English translations would be Baruch, the son of Neriah. They have found some that say Yerahmeel, son of the king. In our Bibles, that would be translated one of the kings, Jehoiakim or something. So there's several that they have found. Gemaru, the son of Shaphan, or Gemariah. And those are names we find in the Old Testament. The problem is a lot of those things are still being disputed and discussed, and so that's why I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, as to whether they're trying to decide whether they actually refer to these biblical characters or not. But even if they don't, they certainly show the common use, those names in use during those time periods. So we're going to move on to the Moabite stone, which is pretty important. It was a rock that was discovered about 150 years ago. It's pretty well known in archaeological circles, although you may not hear much about it. It's also called the Mesha inscription, since it was written by Mesha, king of Moab, hence the Moabite stone. And a missionary found it in 1868. It measured 3.5 feet high and 2 feet wide. And so after he found it, a French scholar tracked it down, and he copied 8 lines from the stone. He then had an impression known as a squeeze made of the writing on its surface. Anybody want to know how he did that? It's pretty interesting. He took a soggy piece of paper and he laid it over the stone inscription. And then, when it dries, when you peel it off, you've got, the inscription in this piece of paper. And unfortunately, they don't really know what happened right after that, but there were Arabs in possession of the stone, and they decided to shatter it. So they heated it in fire, poured cold water on it, and broke it into several pieces. And they don't really know why they did that. Some said because that Ottomans were trying to purchase it and they hated Ottomans, and others said they did it for other reasons, religious or whatever. But the pieces got scattered, but eventually they found about 2/3 of the original stone, and it currently resides in the Louvre in Paris. So this king of Moab, Mesha, had the stone cut in about 850 BC to record his numerous conquests and his reacquisition of certain territories controlled by Israel. And it's about a 30-line text composed of 260 words, and here's the interesting part. He mentions that Omri was the king of Israel who had oppressed Moab. Now, is Omri mentioned in the Old Testament? The house of Omri. And who was of the house of Omri? Who was his son? Ahab. Oh, Ahab. It mentions Omri, and then Mesha says that he saw his desire upon Omri's son and upon his house. He writes, I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, king of Moab, the Debonite. My father had reigned over Moab 30 years, and I reigned after my father, who made this high place for Chemosh in Qarha. Chemosh, of course, their god. Because he saved me from all the kings and caused me to triumph over all my adversaries. As for Omri, king of Israel, he humbled Moab many years, for Chemosh was angry at his land, and his son followed him. And he also said, I will humble Moab. In my time he spoke thus, but I have triumphed over him and over his house, while Israel hath perished forever. Well, that's, exaggeration. But it, of course, confirms that Omri was king of Israel, just like we're told in 1 Kings 16, 21 through 28. It also mentions Ahab, Omri's son, in close connection with the Moabites, as does 2 Kings. Look over 2 Kings chapter 3. It's interesting, though, from the Bible, we're never told that Omri's the one that brought Moab back under the Israelites' domination. Mesha mentions it. Let's see, 2 Kings 3. Look about verse 4. Now Mesha, king of Moab. How about that? The Bible mentions Mesha, king of Moab, and here we have a stone that was inscribed by Mesha, king of Moab, or by his people. Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder, and he regularly paid the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But it happened when Ahab died that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. Now notice, we're already told in the Bible that Mesha is giving tribute to Ahab. We're not told in the Bible how that came about, but Mesha told us that Omri was the one that did that. It's also interesting that later in this inscription on the Moabite stone, that it names the Israelite tribe of Gad and the Israelite God Yahweh, which this is one of the few references to Yahweh that have been found outside of Palestine proper. And so we have the biblical record that talks about the Moabite subjugation under David and Solomon. And then it says, the Bible tells us that the Moabites had broken free from that right after the kingdom divided after Solomon. But we're not told anywhere in the Bible how that Moab was reclaimed and resubjugated. But lo and behold, Mesha tells us. He says, well, Ahab's dad did it, Omri. He's the one that resubjugated Moab, and that's the reason I was having to pay Ahab all this wool and give him all these lambs every year, because that was, the payment I had to make. And so it's just kind of interesting that the Moabite stone gives us information from the Moabite point of view, if you will. Just like the stuff in Nineveh gave us information from Sennacherib's point of view. But of course, you understand that these ancient kings like to sometimes exaggerate things in their favor. I mean, they wanted to look good after they were gone. So, saying that Israelites perished forever was a little bit of an overstatement in the days of Mesha. In fact, it was a big overstatement. but just his way of making himself look big. They have also found the reading of the name David recently in a formerly unreadable line on the Moabite stone, House of David. You know, for years there was discussion among biblical critics that the House of David did not exist. And yet the more and more archaeologists dig, they find references to the House of David. And that it was known throughout that region. The Cyrus cylinder is next on our list. This is always an interesting one. You've probably studied before. Cyrus, who was Cyrus? King of the Medes and Persians, one of the most important foreign rulers as far as the Israelites are concerned. There are a lot of Old Testament prophecies regarding Cyrus, because what did Cyrus do? Isaiah prophesied that Cyrus would conquer the Babylonians, but he also prophesied 150 years before he was born, maybe even 200 years before he was born, 150 years before he did it. He prophesied that Cyrus would let the Israelites return to their land. Of course, Cyrus took Babylon in 539 BC. And we've looked at this passage before, but we know that God called Cyrus his what? Go over to Isaiah chapter 44. How did he refer to Cyrus? His servant and his shepherd, did he not? Look at Isaiah 44:28. Who says of Cyrus, 150, 200 years before, he is my shepherd. He shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him, and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so the gates will not be shut, and so forth. A lot of this, of course, is very detailed as far as his entrance into Babylon. In 1879, a fellow, and I'm not going to pronounce his name, found a small clay cylinder about 9 inches long, and it now resides in the British Museum if you want to go see it. He found it in what was left, the ruins of Babylon. And upon the clay cylinder, King Cyrus had inscribed, among other things, his victory over Babylon and his policy toward the nations that he captured and toward their various gods and religions. So here's what the cylinder says. I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which had been in ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. Furthermore, I resettled upon the command of Marduk, the great Lord, that was his god, all the gods of Sumer and Akkad, of whom Nabonidus has brought into Babylon, to the anger of the Lord of the gods, unharmed in their former chapels, the places which made them happy. May all the gods who I have resettled in their sacred cities ask daily Bel and Nebo for long life for me, and may they recommend me to Marduk my Lord. May they say thus, Cyrus, the king who worships you, and Cambyses his son, all of them I settled in a peaceful place. Cyrus is pretty smart. Now here's Babylon. They capture people. The Assyrians did the same way. What was their policy with captured peoples? Relocate them. That's how you weaken them. You move them totally somewhere else. And then you bring somebody else that you captured and put them in their place. That's what they did. Cyrus comes along and says, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let everybody go back home. They'll be happy. But more importantly, who's going to be happy? No. Who does Cyrus say is going to be happy? Their gods are going to be happy. I'm going to let them go back and put their gods back in their sanctuaries, in their chapels, in their temples, where they came from, so that their gods will be happy, and their gods will do what? They'll like me. They'll bless me, and they'll even recommend me to Marduk, my god. So see how smart that is? And so what we have is confirmation of Cyrus's policy. He didn't do this just for the Jews. Now, we have a particular edict in the Bible regarding the Jews from Cyrus, and I have no doubt that Cyrus did that for all these people, that he probably wrote a specific order or command for each group of people that he was sending home. But this cylinder just records his overall policy. This is what I'm doing with all of these people. And it confirms, of course, what God said Cyrus was going to do well before he was born. It's been hailed as Cyrus's Declaration of Human Rights. And so again, it is a witness to the historical accuracy, the factual accuracy of the biblical text. Well, guess what? That gets us to the end of our discussion of Old Testament archaeological confirmation. And so next week we'll pick up with the New Testament. We've got quite a bit to discuss, but some pretty interesting stuff. So we'll pick up there next week.